The restaurant pulsed with a quiet rhythm, the kind that only the wealthy could afford. Conversations that didn't need to rush. Laughter that carried the kind of confidence only those untouched by struggle seemed to have, and the constant clink of crystal glasses against one another. Waiters moved like dancers in choreographed silence, sliding between tables, setting down plates with precision. The golden glow of chandeliers overhead softened everything, as if money itself radiated through the air. In the middle of it all, Claire wove between chairs, with a tray balanced perfectly on her palm, her face composed, her smile polite. She was only 24, yet the lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes betrayed the truth of her days. Her hair, pulled back into a neat bun, always threatened to escape in rebellious strands that framed her face. The uniform she wore, tailored enough to look presentable, was old and worn at the seams. It wasn't the clothes that gave her away, though. It was her eyes. They didn't sparkle with careless luxury. They held something else. Weight, responsibility, a kind of tired determination that had no place in a palace of indulgence. Claire didn't belong here, but she needed to be here. Her brother Julian, only 16, waited at home for her envelope of cash at the end of each week. School fees weren't cheap, and after their parents had passed, Claire had become everything: sister, mother, provider. Every time she tied her apron strings, she reminded herself that it was worth it. Every blister, every condescending look from the kind of customers who barely acknowledged her existence was worth it. "Table 4 needs their order," repeated Claire. Whispered Angela, another waitress who passed by her with a tray of champagne. "They say you didn't write it down right." Claire forced a smile, nodded, and headed back to table 4. A group of businessmen, already red, faced from their second bottle of wine, were chuckling too loudly at something one of them had said. She asked politely if she could confirm their order, her tone professional, her back straight. They laughed about her accent, about the way she repeated steak au poivre perfectly, while one of them slurred his attempt at pronouncing it. She smiled, endured, moved on. That was what she did, endure. But then she noticed the old woman at table 12, sitting alone, hands trembling as she tried to flip through the menu. Her eyes darted nervously around, as if every polished surface mocked her. Claire approached with her usual polite greeting. The woman looked up, and in broken English murmured, "I do not understand the words." She gestured helplessly at the menu, her fingers quivering. Something softened in Claire instantly. She recognized that look. Helplessness, embarrassment, the fear of being judged. She remembered her own mother in those final months, trying to sign hospital papers in a language that wasn't hers. Claire leaned closer, her voice gentle but steady. "Suhaites, vos que je vous aide, madame." The old woman blinked in shock, then smiled with visible relief. "Oh, vous parlez français." Claire nodded, her French flowing easily, warm like a familiar melody. "Yes, of course. Tell me what you'd like, and I'll make sure the kitchen understands." The woman's stiff posture softened. Her face, wrinkled yet kind, relaxed as she leaned closer, confiding her preferences in her native tongue. Claire listened attentively, repeating back the details with clarity, assuring her that everything would be perfect. The woman reached out, gently patting Claire's hand with gratitude. "Merci, ma chère. You are very kind." Claire smiled, her heart full in that moment. For once, she wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who could bridge a gap, someone who could make another human being feel safe and understood. But while she spoke, while her eyes met the woman's with kindness, someone else was watching. At the far corner of the restaurant, seated by the window where city lights shimmered beyond the glass, Alexander Sterling observed with quiet intensity. He was a man who drew whispers wherever he went, though in this setting, few realized who he was. His fortune was the kind most people only read about, and his reputation was as sharp as his perfectly tailored suits. Unlike the boisterous businessman nearby, he dressed in simplicity. A black suit, a plain tie, a wristwatch worth more than most people's homes. His power didn't shout, it whispered, and the world leaned in to listen. And yet, even with all the luxury at his fingertips, he was restless tonight. The meal in front of him sat untouched, his glass of wine barely raised. He had been lost in thought, considering the endless projects and meetings waiting for him, until the sound of French caught his ear. At first, it was the language itself that drew his attention, but then it was the way she spoke it. Effortlessly, gracefully, with a tone that wasn't just fluent but deeply respectful. His gaze shifted, curious. A waitress, leaning toward an old woman, speaking as though she had been born in Paris. No hesitation, no stiffness, just genuine warmth. Alexander leaned back in his chair, intrigued. He had sat in countless rooms where polished professionals tried to impress him with their rehearsed charm. And yet here was this young woman, unaware she was being observed, showing a kind of elegance money couldn't buy. She didn't fawn. She didn't flatter. She simply gave her best to someone who needed it. He studied her closer. There was discipline in the way she carried herself, but her smile wasn't mechanical. When the old woman laughed softly, Claire laughed with her, not too loud, not forced, but with a sincerity that reached her eyes. Alexander noticed how the other waiters passed by, with practiced indifference. But she stopped, listened and cared. She had no idea he was listening, no idea his attention had shifted entirely to her. For a man like Alexander, interest wasn't something that came easily. He had everything. Yet most people bored him within minutes. They wanted something from him, always. But this young waitress, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply herself. When Claire excused herself to take the order to the kitchen, Alexander's eyes followed her, his mind already full of questions. Who was she? How did a waitress in an upscale restaurant speak French with such ease? Where did she learn it? He lifted his glass, swirling the wine without drinking, his lips curling into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Something about this evening had just changed, and Claire, still unaware, hurried toward the kitchen, clutching the old woman's order slip. To her, it had just been another moment of kindness in a long night of work. She couldn't know that, with a few simple words spoken in French, she had caught the attention of the man who could alter the entire course of her life. The restaurant went on buzzing around them. Forks lifted, deals were whispered, and laughter echoed across linen, draped tables. Yet in the quiet corner where Alexander Sterling sat, a story had already begun, one that Claire didn't even know she was part of. She thought she was invisible, but the most powerful man in the room had seen her. And he wasn't going to forget. The city had settled into its late night rhythm by the time Claire finally untied her apron and slipped into the narrow back alley behind the restaurant. Her feet ached from hours of balancing trays and dodging impatient guests. But the cool night air kissed her skin like a small relief. She leaned against the brick wall, closing her eyes for just a moment, feeling the night breeze wrap around her, as though reminding her that outside of the golden chandeliers and polished tables, life was simpler. It was here, in the shadows of the alley, that she allowed herself to breathe like a human rather than perform like a servant. But she wasn't alone. At the end of the alley, a sleek black car idled, its engine a soft purr in the silence. A driver leaned against the hood, phone in hand, but his sharp eyes darted toward Claire. When she stepped outside, he looked out a place in this worn, litter, scattered alleyway, his immaculate suit too crisp, his posture too precise. Claire barely spared him a glance. The wealthy often had drivers waiting outside, and she had no reason to think twice. She tightened her scarf around her neck and started walking toward the bus stop 2 streets away. The city was dangerous at night, but she had no choice. Taxes cost too much, and every dollar mattered. She walked with quick, determined steps, clutching her small bag close to her chest. Behind her, a pair of footsteps echoed faintly. She glanced back, her heart stuttering until she realized it was just another man in a suit. He walked with ease, his stride purposeful yet unhurried, as though the night itself bent around his presence. She didn't know him, of course. She didn't know that this was the same man who had watched her earlier from the corner of the restaurant. Alexander Sterling. He wasn't the type to approach strangers. His time was too valuable, and his trust too rare. But something about Claire had unsettled the calm waters of his composure. He had left the restaurant earlier than usual, his meal untouched, instructing his driver to follow the young waitress at a distance. Curiosity wasn't a habit he entertained often. But tonight, curiosity had won. Claire felt the hairs at the back of her neck prickle, but she shook it off, forcing herself to stay calm. She boarded the bus when it came rattling down the street, nearly empty at this hour, and sank into a seat by the window. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the city blur past in streaks of neon and shadow. She thought about the old woman at the restaurant, how her eyes had lit up when someone finally spoke to her in her own language. That small exchange had warmed Claire's heart in a way tips never could. For a fleeting moment, she had felt important, like her life had a purpose beyond surviving. She held on to that feeling as the bus rolled through the city, unaware that a black car trailed quietly behind, carrying a man whose mind was still replaying her voice in fluent French. Alexander sat in the back of his car, his hands folded loosely, his gaze fixed on the glowing city outside. His assistant, who had joined him, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, about tomorrow's meeting." "Later." Alexander interrupted, his tone sharp but calm. He wasn't ready to explain why his mind was elsewhere, why he was following a waitress home through the city like some detective searching for clues. To most people, she was invisible. But to him, she had become the most interesting puzzle of the evening. The bus screeched to a stop in a worn, down neighborhood where streetlights flickered unreliably. Claire stepped off, adjusting her scarf against the cool air. She walked briskly, weaving through narrow streets, until she reached a small apartment building with peeling paint and rusted stair rails. She climbed the steps 2 at a time, glancing around out of habit before slipping inside. Upstairs, Julian sat at the small kitchen table, his book spread out, his brow furrowed in concentration. His face lit up when he saw her. "Claire, you're late." "I know," she said, setting her bag down and ruffling his hair. "But I made it. Did you eat?" He nodded, pushing away an empty plate. "I saved you some bread." She smiled, though her heart ached at the simplicity of it. Bread. That was dinner tonight, but she swallowed the ache, determined not to let him see. "Good. Now, show me what you're working on." They sat together for nearly an hour, her guiding him through math problems, her voice patient even though exhaustion tugged at her eyelids. When he finally closed his notebook, satisfied, she kissed his forehead and sent him to bed. Only when the apartment was quiet did she allow herself to sink into the old armchair, her mind drifting back to the restaurant. She had no idea that at that same moment, Alexander was reviewing a discreet background report his assistant had gathered on her. Name Claire Bennett, age 24. No criminal record. Studied French literature at a local university for 2 years before dropping out due to financial hardship. Works double shifts at La Lumière, the city's most prestigious French restaurant. Guardian of younger brother, Julian Bennett, 16. Lives in a modest apartment in Eastbrook. Alexander read the details without judgment, but with growing interest. He admired resilience, and every detail in the report painted a picture of someone who had endured more than most yet carried herself with dignity. She wasn't simply a waitress. She was someone who had been forced into sacrifice, someone who had skills and intelligence hidden beneath the plain black uniform she wore. The next evening, when Claire arrived at work, she tried not to think about the exhaustion that clung to her bones. She had trained herself to leave her personal life at the door, to step into the role of the quiet, efficient waitress. But when she stepped onto the restaurant floor, her heart jolted. There he was, the man from the corner table. She hadn't noticed him last night, but tonight his presence was impossible to ignore. He sat alone again, a dark suit framing his broad shoulders, his gaze sharp but unreadable. He looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom, not at a table for one. Claire forced herself to remain professional, approaching his table with her practiced smile. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to begin with something to drink?" His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment she felt pinned under their weight. "Red wine, Bordeaux, 2005. His voice was smooth, deep, commanding in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Of course." She scribbled it down. Though she didn't need to, she would remember. She always remembered. When she returned with the wine, she placed it carefully before him. He studied her, not the glass, and she felt the intensity of it even as she straightened and prepared to leave. "You speak French?" he said suddenly. She paused, startled. "Ah, yes. A little. Not a little," he corrected, fluently. Her cheeks warmed. "It's just something I studied. We're..." She hesitated, unsure why a customer was asking her personal questions. But his tone wasn't mocking. It was curious, genuine. "At university," she admitted softly, "I studied literature. But I couldn't finish." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "And now you work here?" She stiffened slightly. "Yes, that's life." She offered a polite smile, eager to retreat, but he said nothing more. He let her go, though his eyes followed her every step. Throughout the night, she caught him watching her. Not in the leering way some men did, but with a focus that unsettled her. It was as though he saw through the uniform, through the practiced smiles, down to the truth she tried to keep hidden. When the restaurant finally began to quiet, he left without fanfare, sliding a folded card into the bill folder. Claire found it later when she cleared the table. A business card. Heavy paper, embossed letters. Alexander Sterling. Sterling Enterprises. Her breath caught. She had heard the name before. Everyone had. Billionaire. Investor. A man who owned half the skyline. What on earth was he doing in this restaurant, watching her of all people? She slipped the card into her pocket, her hands trembling. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 4 words. "Let's continue this conversation." The morning sun had not yet fully broken over the city when Claire stepped out into the chill of early autumn. Her mind was still buzzing from last night, the business card, the neatly written words, the unnerving intensity of Alexander Sterling's gaze. She tried to tell herself it was just business, that billionaires had eccentricities and odd habits, and that she had nothing to do with his world. But the truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Her day began as always, rushing to catch the bus, juggling orders, and keeping an eye on Julian, who now was accustomed to breakfast being a hurried affair. She kissed his forehead, reminded him of homework, and sent him off to school, trying to push the memory of Alexander out of her mind. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him sitting at the corner table, studying her as if he had known her all her life. By the time she arrived at La Lumiere, the restaurant buzzed with energy. Waiters whispered to one another about the mysterious man who had left the card. Even Angela, her friend and co-worker, noticed the faint flush on Claire's cheeks. "Something happened last night," didn't it? Angela asked slyly as they set down menus for incoming guests. Claire shook her head, forcing a casual smile. Nothing. Just a customer. Angela raised an eyebrow but let it go. She knew better than to pry when Claire's mood was a mixture of excitement and caution. When Claire stepped onto the floor, she froze momentarily. There he was again, seated at the same corner table, alone. This time, there was no business meeting, no silent observation, just him waiting. His gaze lifted and held hers, calm and unwavering. "Good morning." "Sir," Claire said cautiously as she approached. "May I get you something to drink?" He smiled faintly, an almost imperceptible tilt of his lips that made her stomach tighten. "Good morning, Claire." "Yes, coffee, black. And perhaps we can talk." Her hands trembled slightly as she nodded, careful not to let it show. She poured the coffee with precise motions, her mind racing. Talk. What could a man like Alexander Sterling want to talk about with a waitress like her? He watched her carefully as she set the cup before him. "You were speaking French last night," he said, his tone conversational but not overly casual. "With the old woman." "I couldn't help but notice." Claire swallowed. "It's something I studied. Just a little thing I learned." "Not a little," he replied gently. "It's rare to find someone who can speak fluently, naturally, with warmth. Most people learn languages like tools. They forget the soul behind them. You, however," he paused, studying her, "you have a gift." Claire felt heat rising in her cheeks. She had never been praised for anything other than her work ethic. Compliments were rare and often hollow in her world. She blinked, unsure what to say. "I thank you," she whispered. Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching her reactions with an intensity that made her feel both nervous and curious. "Tell me something, Claire. How did you learn to care so easily for others, yet keep such strength in yourself?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She wasn't used to strangers asking questions like that. Not rich men, not powerful men, not anyone. And yet, there was a sincerity in his voice, a lack of judgment. I had to," she finally said. "Life doesn't give you the choice to be weak when someone depends on you." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "And you have someone depending on you?" "My brother, Julian." He said quietly. "That explains the weight in your eyes. Responsibility." He sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving her. "It's admirable." Claire lowered her gaze, trying to appear composed while her heart raced. She had never been admired for anything other than her hard work, and certainly not by someone like Alexander Sterling. The morning passed slowly, but their brief interactions during her rounds built a strange connection. He didn't ask for favors. He didn't test her intelligence. He simply watched, listened, and occasionally made observations that made her think, laugh, or pause. By midday, whispers spread among the staff about the mysterious billionaire's attentee